Hello and welcome to another episode of Connection Alchemy. I'm Emma Buggy and I'm here with my dear friend Andy Hicks.
Hello.
And today, for Movember, we are recording an episode for you that is specifically with the question, why do we need to talk about men? Why are men really struggling at the moment? And so whether you identify as a man or a woman or any other gender, I know I myself am very curious to hear about the experience of men in today's culture. And Andy has a course that he's been running specifically on that question. Why are men struggling right now?
Yeah.
So for those of you who are new to this podcast, this is a podcast that is specifically here to support us to translate our relationship garbage, all of those ways in which we get disconnected to ourselves and to each other, into a golden opportunity for connection. Myself and Andy are both coaches. Do you want to say a word or two about what you do?
Yes, so I support people, many of them are men, with things like feeling inadequate, feeling overwhelmed, depressed, anxious, and I share with them simple, powerful, mindfulness-based tools and techniques to help them to feel happier, healthier, and more whole.
Yeah, it's a perfect person to be speaking with today about men.
Ideal.
And their experiences.
Yeah.
And I'm a relationship coach and a conflict transformation trainer, and the main thing that I support people with is conflict and transforming conflict into connection. I work with couples, organizations, and I have my own community of people that come and do workshops with me specifically to make conflict into an opportunity to really stay connected. But today the focus is going to be on you, Andy. And I want to ask you, why do we need to talk about men right now?
Well, there are many measures in which men are actually falling behind women, men and boys. So, for example, in education, in pretty much every subject now, girls are doing better than boys.
Wow.
If you look at...
I had no idea.
Yeah, and it's basically only maths and PE where boys are doing better.
Can I just say, you would really expect that to be the opposite? Like, I don't know, just how I've grown up as a woman, I've expected that boys do better at school.
Really?
Yeah.
That was the... Okay.
That they're better at maths and science and all the logical subjects, but...
Yeah, there's a few number of subjects like maths and physics, PE, where they're doing better, but the majority of them, girls do better. And then when you look at higher education, 58% of graduates are women.
Wow.
Only 42% are men.
Wow.
So women have shot past in terms of how many are doing higher education, which then has huge implications for your ability to earn a good salary later on in life. Mm-hmm. It can also have implications for marriage and for longer term relationships, because a lot of women would like to be with someone with the same level of education as them, not who's less educated with them. So it can give men difficulties in finding a partner, and women. And then whilst at school, the majority, I think it's something like 80 or 90% of people who are excluded are boys.
80 to 90%.
Yep.
Wow, I'm already, my mind is already drawing conclusions around that. I'm imagining that's to do with rough and tumbles and fighting or aggression or...
Yeah, so that if we talk about biological differences between genders, then men generally do have a lot more testosterone, which does make them more aggressive. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't have to result in violence and abusive behaviour. Not all men do that, but this tendency towards aggression does make it much more boys and men who end up doing things which get them in trouble in that way than girls. And that comes across not only in exclusions, but also high school shootings. 97% of those are carried out by men or boys.
Wow. And I'm already like, just like, I know that I have like 1,000 questions and points that I already, like, I kind of want to pause and breathe with you at this moment. That it's like, I can imagine some listeners will be like, oh, but those are unfair numbers and calculations to come to. Surely there's many societal factors that feed into those things. And we're going to come to that later.
Yeah, we'll talk a bit about why this might be. And it's very complex and many, many factors. But I just wanted to start with a few sort of statistics to give it a bit of a picture that show that there are many men struggling. So there's the education aspect. There is the fact that I think it's about 95% of people in prison are men.
95% of people in prison are men. Wow. So it's the overwhelming majority.
The overwhelming majority.
Yeah.
75% of alcoholics are men.
Yeah, I remember you saying this one to me before.
And about 75% of suicides as well.
So 75% alcoholics, 75% suicides, and 95% of people in prison are men. I noticed in me is such a mourning there. It's not that I want anyone. I don't want that to be shared equally across genders, you know. I like my ideal would be that those statistics are not there for anyone, but that really somehow gets me in touch with like a question around the suffering, or like how come, why is that?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really important question. And when I ask people when I run this workshop, what feelings does it bring up when I share with you these statistics, then the biggest one is sadness that comes up. It's really, really sad that so many men are suffering in a very, very desperate way. And there's a recent term that's been coined in America is something called deaths of despair. And what that encapsulates is overdoses, suicides, people who die from alcoholism, and I think it's something like 3 times as many men die from deaths of despair as women.
Wow.
And I think there's something really sort of poignant about that term. Like, I just can't cope with my life. I can't cope with how I feel every day. And there are so many more men who haven't died from the despair, but they're just living with it every day.
They're living with that depression. And I imagine, like, you know, anxiety, anger, overwhelm, aloneness. I wonder if there's also a lot of confusion around, like, what is it to be a man? Who am I, like, as a person? But then also my masculinity. That word masculinity is being brought up a lot in different forms, and I remember you speaking with me about that, and I don't know if now's the moment, but I wonder if you could say something to, you know, how men are responding to masculinity in different ways, and how that might be affecting also their experience of despair or confusion or sadness. Yeah,
it feels important to say at this point that I think it's really valuable to do what we're doing now and acknowledge the sadness of the situation, because a lot of what I see is the discourse, whether it's in newspapers or on social media around masculinity, seems to be coming more not from a place of we feel sad, we feel a lot of care for what men are experiencing, but anger. A lot of
anger towards men.
Anger towards men about toxic masculinity.
Yeah, that's a word that I've heard a lot, and particularly in circles that, you know, tend to maybe label themselves as more progressive, spiritual, that kind of labeling. You know, the word toxic masculinity is thrown around a lot, and I always cringe when I hear that. It like creates it's almost like a sharpness in my stomach. It's like, okay, I understand that we're pointing towards something that wants to be balanced or addressed here, but to call it toxic, it's almost like this word narcissist is used to describe anyone who does something to you that you dislike, and therefore the actual narcissism is like is somehow diluted, and rather than that, it's more that we're not looking at actually what's going on for those people. By labeling them, we put them into a very painful box where they don't have a chance to be who they are, and also that their reactions, their actions that we label as toxic are not being questioned and cared for.
Yeah, I think the phrase that comes to mind for me is writing someone off. Or you're just a narcissist.
Yeah, you're just toxic. Yeah. And then that means that there's no human being there. If you're toxic or you're a narcissist, you're not human.
Yeah, and I think it seems like a strong word to use, but to me the word that comes up is evil.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
You're an evil narcissist. You're an evil toxicity. It's like an evil, bad. There's nothing good about that. It's irredeemable.
Yeah. There is no human underneath it.
Yeah, it's dehumanizing.
It's been poisoned. Yeah.
Yeah. So to repeat this idea again and again, that men have a kind of poison in them.
Yeah.
That is connected with their masculinity, I think is so damaging.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really damaging. I can only imagine as a man receiving that message again and again that I would be doubling back and questioning myself and kind of going, oh, am I toxic? And is there something inherently wrong with me for being a man?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious to know, because what reading I've done around toxic masculinity have suggested that it's used in a very all-encompassing, broad brush way.
Yeah.
And there isn't sort of a real clear, agreed upon definition. So I wonder, when you hear the term toxic masculinity, do you have a definition? What does it mean?
I mean, I have explored this in certain courses that I've done, which I won't name, and I've had a resistance to the word. But when I've explored it and understood it, what I'm left with, and I really want to name this as my understanding, is that it's recognizing the power over and dominance that the masculine energy, I don't want to say men, because it's again just labeling all men, but this idea of the masculine energy, the yang, can have a very dominating and power over, I'm in charge, I know what's right, I'm going to make the decisions regardless of who suffers. And that comes from, that dominance can be very... it can have a very powerful effect on those that receive it, and that it can then be, it can also be expressed with aggression and with violence. Yeah.
Yeah, and what comes to mind as you say that is like the idea that most of the wars in history have been started by men.
Yes, I was immediately thinking of all of these people in power that I could say, well, that we could label. If we were going to play this game of labeling, I could very easily label that person and that person and that person, all those leaders as toxic, representations of toxic masculinity.
Yeah, and I think there is a lot of truth in that. Almost all wars, genocides and rapes have been carried out by men.
Yeah, almost all.
Almost all.
Yeah.
No, it's definitely nowhere near 50-50.
No, yeah.
But what that can then leave a man with is this idea of like, I'm responsible for all the evil that's ever happened in the world and that continues to happen. Which is quite a lot to put on.
And that's not true.
It's not true.
It's not true, yeah. Yeah, and that's a huge burden and a huge pain and a huge responsibility for any individual to carry and to bring towards themselves as like, I'm responsible for that.
Exactly.
And there's no space for you to be human then, to make any mistakes.
No space to make mistakes, to be human, and also to have what's painful for us about these masculine stereotypes as well. Because they oppress us. They oppress us in creating an impossible ideal for what we should be like. That we should be like almost like Superman. We should be massively strong. We should not show weakness. We should be powerful, have high status, have lots of money, sleep with lots of women, but also have loyalty and have a long-term relationship and have a family. And
I was going to say there's also the opposite because there's different stereotypes that are created with this new age spirituality. There's also like the stereotype of like, oh, I want a man who's also done all of his inner work, who is really self-aware, who is a great communicator, who is sensitive and who can cry, who knows how to cook, is equally good at doing the cleaning around the house, and if he's not, then how dare you? And I feel afraid to even name those things because I'm sure that there's women or people listening that are just like, of course, I want any human being to have those traits. But I'm talking about the expectation of I want you to be all of those things plus the protector, plus the moneymaker, plus the provider and the power and it's just like, wow.
Yeah.
I feel overwhelmed imagining that all of that is expected of me.
Yeah, it is. It creates a huge pressure on men that I think is unrealistic. And that's not to say that it's worse for men than women, because women have their own pressures of needing to be perfect in every single way.
Yeah, and I almost want to name that I notice this. I have a frustration in what I'm noticing right now. Like, I'm frustrated towards the noticing a part of me that wants to go, of course, but women have been through thousands of years of struggling under, patriarchy and masculine overpowerment. And so it's about time that men came down to earth and had an experience. And I could really go into that voice of what many women or other genders might want to express. And that, why am I frustrated with that? Because then it takes away from the focus on actually the struggle of men right now. And I have this sense that very often in positions where there has been somebody who's considered as having the power over position, that of course we want to bring balance by focusing and caring for those who are underneath that, who are in the position of power under, to bring them into balance, to make sure that they have a voice. And that's my natural wish in order to bring equality. But the shadow of that is that we can then completely not give space to the struggle of those that are now like dealing with that identity of the power over position. And as I name this, I'm just left with the complexity of this, because I'm now, it's almost as if I'm saying men are naturally power over. No, it's that's the image that has been portrayed and created and painted by history. That doesn't mean that that's the position that men are always in or predominantly in.
Yeah, what comes to mind is imperialist, like the British in India, and we often focus on how oppressive they were to the Indian people, but it would seem almost ridiculous to be like, oh, but what about those poor imperialists?
Yeah,
wasn't it difficult for them?
Yeah, it's like I want to scream, I want to swear, like fuck off! I'm not going to have empathy for the imperialists.
Yeah.
And this is kind of pointing to a very contentious and edgy issue that I'm very afraid to name is present in so many aspects of polarization. And I feel like it's so important for me to say, it's like, I'm not asking for those who are oppressed to have empathy for the oppressor. I'm not asking for anyone out there listening to this who sees themselves in a position of being oppressed by a certain culture or a country or another person, that you now need to be empathetic to the person that you experience yourself as being oppressed by. And even that language it needs so much more attention, but I'm going to leave it there. And at the same time, to now say like all men are oppressing women. God, I feel I just almost want to take a breath with you, because I feel so overwhelmed by this in and of itself.
Yeah.
There's so much complexity to this. Like, how do we even talk about these things? I can't even talk about it in a way, like with a podcast and people listening, taking into account everyone's different perspectives. I want to be sensitive to everyone's different perspectives, whilst I really want the focus to be on men right now. And I think that's where I get to. I think saying that now, I can really shift my focus and be like, okay, no, let's really stay with the male experience and not all of the other complexities that feed into that.
One of the things that I feel like you've really taught me, Emma, is if you're having an argument with someone, they won't listen to a word you say unless you've helped them to feel really heard and really listen to everything that their pain is painful for them and they're angry about, and only then will they listen to you. Well,
also if I've also been heard, so it's more complex than that. But yes, if you've both been hurt. If we've both been heard, yes. So it doesn't work. Heard. Yeah. If I'm not available to listen to you and I start listening to you, then I'm not really listening to you.
Yeah.
So if I have availability to listen to you first, because I have the skills and the availability to do that, then yes,
you're
more likely to be able to hear me afterwards. And I don't want to listen to you in a manipulative way with a sense of, I'll listen to you first so that you listen to me after. So it's a complex thing that you've named there. But yes, if somebody is full of anger or upset, they're not going to have space to hear me.
Yeah, and the reason I bring that up is that I feel like taking the time to acknowledge these issues that affect men, that I feel like for a long time have been neglected, and that a lot of, perhaps you could say, women or feminists have had a resistance to acknowledging, seeing that there are women and feminists who are willing to acknowledge this pain and this difficulty, and acknowledging it more for myself, I feel more open to hearing the issues that women face.
Yeah.
And I wonder if a lot of the difficulty in the discourse around masculinity is that no one wants to listen to each other because no one's willing to listen to each other's pain.
No one wants to go first.
No one wants to go first.
Because even you saying that, I'm like, yeah, but, you know, women have had it hard a lot longer, so you can understand why we want to be heard first.
I can understand.
And at the same time, I have a sense that there has been a voice that's being heard, and it's still not balanced. It's still not balanced. That's why the voice is still there from the feminine and saying that we need to be heard more. It's still not balanced. And yet we can keep playing that rhetoric for centuries, and then the male voice will never get heard, and we won't bridge that gap. We won't get to see each other.
Yeah, and we're just in this eternal, you listen, no, you listen.
Well, then nobody's there to listen.
Exactly.
And then we stay separate in our own pain and create a fight against each other rather than being together in this.
Exactly.
Together in all of this kind of, you know, this toxicity of the culture, not of the person or the individual, that is affecting all of us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, finding the common humanity.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if we could segue into a bit more around personal experience, because we're talking in quite broad terms at the moment.
Please, Andy, take us there.
Okay, great. So I first started reflecting on this topic when a therapist said to me, Andy, I don't think you've developed your own sense of masculinity within yourself, which I felt very kind of confronted by, challenged. But at the same time, it rang true. And I thought about that, and I thought, well, I went to an all-boys secondary school. And the behaviours that I saw in other boys gave me this sense of masculinity is a negative thing. I don't like it. I don't aspire to be like any of these people. And also the adults, the male men in my life, I didn't necessarily see them as being particularly inspiring humans in certain ways. But particularly with boys at school, it was things like lots of bullying. I was bullied. People around me were bullied. But a bit more broadly than bullying, it's like a culture of, talk about this power over, this dominance. Everyone wanting to dominate everybody else. There being this sort of pecking order, this hierarchy, which could be through physical dominance and hitting each other, verbal dominance, taking the piss out of each other. It could even be through humour, that you wanted to be the funniest person because then you got more status in the group. So it was kind of like an all against all mentality that I felt, that was tinged with aggression, that was tinged with wanting to put other people down, a lot of homophobia. The most common insult being you're gay. Nobody coming out of 120 boys as gay.
So that means that those who were experiencing, you know, homophobia through hearing you're gay would and may in themselves identify as gay or bisexual or anything other than straight, I imagine would absolutely not feel safe to name anything.
Yeah,
like,
for fear of being...
It creates a completely opposite culture of acceptance. Like, I'm going to be right at the bottom of the pecking order. I'm going to be bullied and ostracised.
Bullied, ostracised, humiliated, shamed, all the rest of it. Absolutely. And then I really noticed a marked difference when we got the train home, because a lot of us commuted by train. We mixed with the girls' school. And suddenly all the boys seemed to be a lot nicer to each other.
Wow.
And it was almost like they had this sense that girls don't like it if I'm a bit of a bully. Girls want to see something a bit kinder, a bit softer in me, a bit friendlier.
Yeah.
And I noticed it because I've got a sister, the way she was with her friends was just more warm, more open, more tactile, more genuine connection in some way. So I consciously or unconsciously, I think, rejected what I saw. Also, binge drinking. It was a huge part. It was part of all culture.
I was definitely partial to that. Binge drinking as a teenager.
Yeah, it's definitely not just a male thing, but there was something that was sort of like extra male about how much alcohol you could hold.
So it was about how much can you take.
Yeah, can you take 10 pints and be fine?
Yeah.
And then you'd show off about how much you drank the next day as if it was an achievement.
Ah, okay. Yeah. So there's this constant comparison and trying to get to the top of the pecking order. Who's the one that's the most alpha male here, in a sense?
Exactly that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then added to that, what made school difficult for me was that I was a late developer. So it took until I was 15 for my voice to break. I didn't have any facial hair. I was the third smallest in my whole year group, and that made me feel physically vulnerable. And I think bullied more because of that. Made it feel like it's hard to stand up to these bigger boys, but also I felt like I was literally not man enough.
Yeah,
because I'm not
as big
like
as the other boys, as your
not as
secondary
hairy
school, not as hairy, not as tall, not as muscly.
Yeah,
all of those things that decide what makes you a man, or what makes you receive respect or attention.
Yeah,
or worthiness.
Yeah, yeah. And surely girls aren't going to be interested in me because I'm a boy. I'm not a man.
Yeah, and I'm already just noticing such a sadness in me now, like how that infiltrates into like adult men today who might not have the same structures or body that kind of fits that typical masculine story or image. And thankfully I do experience that shifting in some cultures, because there's a lot more gender fluidity and celebration of men being more fluid and free and subtle and different in their body shapes now than they were before. But that's very much a microcosm. And I can imagine so many men still suffering from that, not being enough, not living up to that image.
Exactly. Yeah. And when I ask people in the workshop what were the most what are words that describe the behaviours you saw of boys growing up, the two most common ones they use are bullying and homophobic.
Bullying and homophobic. Yeah, so very, very violent, very unsafe, disconnected, lonely. Secondary school, childhood, teenage experience for many men. Yeah. And
I wonder, were you at a mixed or?
I was at a mixed school.
And do these kind of sort of male behaviours ring true from your experience?
What witnessing? When
you were at school, what did you witness? Yeah.
I went to a really rough school. I didn't really have any friends at the school because I didn't really resonate with many people, and I felt quite lonely. But I do remember being bullied a lot at school and being quite afraid of the boys that were bullying each other and that were bullying everyone. It was like, even it started on the bus ride. I remember there was some boys that would literally beat people up on the bus. Wow. And not just each other, but there was a particular occasion where an elderly gentleman entered onto the bus, and a boy had his leg out in the aisle, like across the aisle, and so the elderly man didn't see it and he tripped. Oh my God. And this boy stood up and beat him till he was bleeding.
What? Beat up an old man?
Yeah. And that was reported to the head teacher. And that boy said on the bus, if I find out anyone speaks to the head teacher and names me, you'll be next. And it took a lot of guts for me to say to the head teacher who it was. And
That's horrific.
Yeah, and I was very, very afraid to be found out. But that behaviour was really consistent. The kids were sometimes, on occasions, fighting each other in the park with chains.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and it was very much. It wasn't just and that what we label there as toxic masculinity, or that kind of dominant bullying behaviour, was also happening with the girls at the school. Like I equally got bullied by girls, so it wasn't just the boys. There was also the girls. I will say, at my school. But it was that taunting, who's going to be at the top of the pecking order kind of behaviour. Yeah. Very difficult school. I didn't learn much. I learned about how to be streetwise, how to keep myself to myself, and it wasn't easy.
Sounds brutal.
Yeah. But yes, I didn't see many bands of boys coming together and being friends, apart from there were a few groups, maybe like that we would call the goths, and they would be bullied by the other boys, but they would stick together, and there was a bit more kind of like closeness or warmth that I would recognise in those groups. And again, you could name or label them as adopting a bit more of the feminine quality of they would wear a bit of makeup, they would wear a bit of eyeliner, and they would hang out, and there was a bit more of that kind of softness in that group.
Wow. Yeah, so there were certain boys that showed a bit of the sort of care and support, and gave each other a sense of a bit of belonging, and but I mean, it's really from an outsider perspective, like, and I'm looking back so many years, so I can't really trust my memory, if I'm honest. Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the point is and it isn't just boys, as you say, it's girls as well, but how many of us grew up in this environment of bullying and domination, and completely opposite of what you'd want to put a child into. You'd want them to be looked after and cared for and supported, nurtured, made to feel like they belong, that they're important. But I think, just bring it back to the influence around masculinity. It's like this sense of, I don't want to be like you. This isn't a positive role model for me. None of you are a positive role model for me.
There's no men out there that I'm now looking at and imagining you as a younger man and going, oh, that's how I want to be when I grow up.
Exactly.
In your immediate relationships.
Exactly that. Yeah. And so I wonder if it's also important or useful to try to define, when we talk about sort of stereotypical masculinity, what actually is that?
Yeah.
Because it's sort of a bit of we kind of know what we mean, but there was a sociologist called Robert Brannan who created a masculinity scale to try to actually measure how masculine people were, which sounds bizarre thing to do.
Wow. Okay.
But what he came up with became a foundation in gender studies for a long time when you're trying to study masculinity. And he came up with 4 key elements based on American culture, which is still hugely influenced now, even though that was 50 years ago. So the first component of masculinity, according to his study, was don't be a sissy.
Don't be a sissy.
So what we're talking about there is any behaviour that could be conceived of as being feminine, homosexual, vulnerable, showing emotion.
So shut down your emotions.
Shut down your emotions.
Don't feel.
Number 1.
Don't feel.
Don't be a
Instead
human.
of don't be a sissy means don't feel and don't be a human. Yeah. Shut down your emotions. Yeah, I can imagine many people resonate with that as an expectation of men.
Yeah. And I think it's a familiar idea, and because it's familiar, we can be slightly immunized from how horrifically damaging that is to do to someone.
Yeah, even as I said it, I was kind of like, oh yeah, that's not new news to me.
We know that one.
We know that one. Yeah.
Don't have feelings.
But then as you said that, like how horrifically damaging, I'm just like, oh yeah, like no, but seriously, to be told that your emotions are not welcome, you need to swallow them, hold them in and not speak.
I just think it's one of the worst things you could do to anyone.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a big statement to make, but...
Yeah.
But, what could be more human than having feelings? What else do we use in determining what's important to us, what's meaningful, what relationships we want to be in, or work we want to do, how we want to spend our time, and how we feel.
How we want to give to the world.
How we want to give to the world.
So actually, I'm now realizing, like, by shutting down our emotions or telling people that you can't feel and you shouldn't feel, it's cutting off access to creativity, to life energy, moving towards giving, towards abundance, towards community.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's like an authenticity.
Very isolating.
Like, cutting yourself off.
Yeah.
And it's like the authenticity of who you are. How you feel about things. It's kind of like it's who you are as a person, and saying you're not allowed to feel something is sort of denying someone's life force, someone's humanity. So that's the big one.
And it's like we laugh right now just because it's so big that it deserves, so much more attention than just naming it.
It does. But we could spend a whole episode on it, but just to cover off the other three.
Yeah.
So then there's what's called the big wheel, which is about being high status. To be a manly man, you need to be dominant, strong, have lots of sexual partners, be funny. You need to be the kingpin.
The kingpin, yeah.
Which we've already talked about, and that connecting to the bullying and all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
The third one he calls the sturdy oak. So it's also the idea of the lone ranger, the lone wolf, self-reliant, unflappable. I can calm in a crisis. I don't need help from anyone. Thank you very much.
Oh God, this feels so tiring and lonely and impossible for any human being to carry.
Yeah. So it's like, I'm going to get bullied, but then I can't cry about it and I can't ask anyone for help.
Yeah. And I need to be on top of my game and able to sustain myself and my family. And I'm not allowed to complain about how hard that might be. And it's all my responsibility. And I'm not even allowed to feel it.
Exactly.
It's like that the immediate image that comes is like a RoboCop, or like a kind of like I have Power Rangers, or like an image of like a robot. It's like like, I'm just gonna go do the task, make things happen, not feel anything, receive the punches, receive the blows. I'm immovable. I can this robotic human. There's no space for the skin, the flesh, the wounds, the vulnerable, the heart.
And as you say that, I'm picturing all these superheroes. I'm picturing Superman, Batman, all these cartoons, and X-Men, and that's exactly what they're like.
Yeah, and they're not able to cry. They're not allowed to. Yeah. And
as boys and men, we watch those films and we lap them up.
Yeah.
And I think there's something it's almost like evil genius to make people enjoy watching something that on a subconscious level is deeply damaging them and brainwashing them to try to think that they need to live up to impossible ideals and suppress who they really are.
Yeah. And it's it's now bringing me towards something you were saying earlier, and I was like, oh, now we need to press record. And you were naming the kind of ideals of masculinity of the modern day man, looking from the perspective of those that we might label as left-leaning politically or right-leaning politically. And I found that quite interesting, and I kind of want to get rid of the labels of left and right, because I find that can be so divisive in and of itself. But there are these polarized ideals of what healthy masculinity in the modern man looks like. And would you be willing to share a bit around what those are?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to... There was a fourth component of the definition of masculinity, which is really important, because it's being willing to resort to violence if necessary. And that being a deep part of what it means to be a manly man. And that connects with militarism, being a soldier, but also if you're a manly man, if someone hits you, you hit them back harder.
Yeah, so that you win. Yeah.
And you can protect your woman, you can protect your tribe, your country.
Yeah, there's definitely an expectation of that.
Yeah. And obviously that's a huge storyline in so many movies. It's about a man being violent.
Yeah.
Many men being violent.
And I want to name something that feels very uncomfortable here as a facilitator of non-violent communication workshops and training. Yeah. There is a part of me, and I want to reiterate here, a part, not the whole of me, that when you say to protect the woman and to protect the children, there's a part of me that wants that. And it's like, I don't want you to hit them. I don't want you to resort to violence. Yeah. That's not what I'm excited about when I think of protection. But there is a desire for protection in some way. Yeah. And I think that in like modern day feminism, that's really looked down upon, to say, I want protection.
And likewise also, is there a part of you that's like, I'd quite like to have a high status man with lots of money and power? There's something attractive about that.
Yeah, the power part doesn't resonate. Money resonates because it helps me to feel secure. And there is a part of me that's detached around where the money comes from. In fact, I'd like to have a lot of money so that then we have that security and it doesn't matter. He doesn't need to be the one that makes it. But when I imagine having children, and I'm really at that age where I would like to have children, the thing that's attractive about a man having enough money to care for us is that I can be vulnerable as a pregnant woman, as a mother, and I can also be powerful in that role by really stepping into that role and giving my energy and focus to my child and to the role of mother, rather than being worried about having enough money to feed us.
Gives you security.
It gives me security, yeah. But there's complexity in that, and I'll leave that there.
Okay, let's park that. That's a whole big topic.
Yeah.
But so to come to this left-right thing, so the point here really is that the discourse of both sides of the political spectrum, and this is generalising, and not all left-wing people think like what I'm going to say, and not all right-wing people think about how I'm going to characterise that perspective. But this is just to say that a lot of the discourse around masculinity, I think, is very unhelpful on both sides. Yeah. So if I could just, in a very sort of broad brush way, characterise the left-wing perspective on masculinity, it would be that men and women are just the same. There are no differences. In fact, there's no point. There are no gender categories that we can define, and we get things like the minister who represents women coming on the radio not being able to say what a woman is.
Yeah, that it's actually, and that lives in me now as we make this podcast, that there will be people who are in pain by us defining masculinity and femininity, or speaking about men as something separate from, from a genderless space. And there's a lot of pain around gender politics and how to even talk about the differences. Yeah. To even be able to talk about the differences. Yeah,
it's a minefield.
Yeah.
And I'm aware that people have got death threats online for saying that a woman is someone who menstruates, for example, that there is a biological aspect of gender. They get hatred rained down upon them, which I can understand, because you're effectively saying that if you are wanting to transition from one gender to another,
then you're not considered as a woman.
Then you're not a woman, and the other way around, you're not a man if you still have the reproductive organs of a woman. So you can understand it, but the part of the impact is it's really hard to then talk about gender.
Yeah, and I think the impact, what we're naming here, is not the wish to be seen as a man or a woman, regardless of your genitals, but the kind of hatred and the expectation and the anger towards those that want to be able to define themselves within one of the other character, or even to just speak about the I am a woman in a woman's body, and this is what it's like, and I'm a man in a man's body, and this is what it's like.
Exactly.
But it's the hatred and the expectation and the anger that then cuts off the space to be able to have those conversations. Yeah, it makes it hard.
It makes it very hard to have any kind of productive conversation, and so and there can be a kind of denial that there is any difference between men and women. Secondly, a denial that inequality between the genders goes both ways. That sexism isn't just against women. Is that?
Yeah. Yes.
And as like like I was talking about earlier, the men are doing a lot worse in education than girls. And there are many, many measures now where men are performing less well than women, but it's almost ignored by the left.
Yeah.
Even in official studies and publications, they just won't acknowledge it.
Yeah. And I understand that, again, because we're talking about thousands of years of patriarchy and the male dominant culture having left women in a position of being the victims of that, being oppressed by that, not being able to move, being expected to be the good wife at home that does the cooking and the cleaning and the da-da-da-da. So I understand where the left is coming from in terms of not wanting to shift yet the focus back to men.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a protective element that's saying, hang on, women are still not receiving equal pay.
Yeah.
Women are expected to go to work when they are menstruating or when they have their babies only 3 or 5 or 6 months old. And if they don't get paid for it. And or they lose their progress on the career ladder because they become mothers. And so there isn't equality. And there's so many other ways in many countries where there isn't equality.
Yeah.
So I understand that, and yet to disown the what was the word you just used? My brain has turned up.
Gender inequality swings both ways.
Yes, no, but sexism was the word you used. Yeah, that's to disown that sexism is happening towards men is really it's really not helpful.
It's not helpful, and it could literally be costing lives. So, for example, very few people are aware that the proportion of men who died from COVID was far higher than those who died from women. That those who died who were women.
Okay.
COVID killed more men than women, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
But that was never acknowledged publicly, and there was never any government action to try to address that.
Okay.
And so it put in that kind of context, it's like if you don't acknowledge that men can be doing worse in certain contexts than women, then they could be more at risk of death.
And I think for me, even more impactful as a statistic, because with COVID, there's question marks, like how come? And for me, the more impactful statistics that you gave earlier are around 95% of people being in jail are men, 75% of people who commit suicide are men, and the other 75% are alcoholics. And for me, those statistics really make me question and say, like we cannot turn away from the suffering of men.
It's real.
It's very real.
Lives.
Yeah.
And the third and final point is this such a focus on this idea of toxic masculinity, which we've talked about, which is a lot of that is coming from the left, from feminists, and it just leaves a lot of men, as we've acknowledged, with this sense of there is something dirty or evil or poisonous in me, and I'm sort of being written off, or my masculinity is being painted in a negative light. Yeah. So then there's the right-wing perspective, which is often actually the polar opposite. So rather there being no difference between men and women, the biological determinism of men and women are very, very different. And actually the best thing, one of the problems is denying that they're different, and that we need to kind of turn the clock back to a sort of 1950s ideal of the men as their provider, the woman as the homemaker, men as being strong, and that you can see that, I think, in what's happening in America, that we see this figure of Donald Trump as being the sort of traditionally macho man, and his VP JD Vance denouncing what he calls childless cat ladies. So women who choose to not have a family, and that they're a sort of threat to the future of America because they're not making babies and being a homemaker. So it's again not helpful to say, well, instead of recognizing that the masculine stereotypes that we've had are damaging and we need to move on from them, the gender roles that we had that become outdated, the right-wing perspective seems to be in part just to say, no, they're not outdated, we need to go back to them.
Yeah. And so then that's sort of also, that keeps us then frozen back in time rather than moving towards something that feels more equal, or that actually just cares for the experiences, because even the word equality is contentious here, and it's more like that cares for the real suffering of both men and women and all genders.
Yes.
And when we go too far into that right perspective of like, let's go right back to the roles that we had in the 1950s, the woman is the homemaker, the man is the one who brings in the money, then I feel caged. I feel totally caged. I'm like, no way. I don't want to go back to that place where I'm being told what to do, being told where my place is. I don't have space to explore my own creativity and my own, and also like, I remember even from my past marriage, and it's not to do with the marriage, it's not to do with the relationship and the person, but, you know, in my last marriage, I was living in a different country and I was getting used to the language. And so I was working a lot less and I had less money, and my partner was the one who was providing a bit more. And it was just by chance we were in that experience. And because I wasn't coming with a kind of boat of my own cash into the relationship to sustain myself, we were like, everything is, we share everything, it's ours. But I felt this instability in myself that if this relationship breaks down, right, without a prenup or something, I don't have the power, I don't have the stability anymore. And I don't think that that's being addressed fully yet, even though there's a lot that's happening legally to ensure that women get, you know, a fair share when there's a divorce or a breakup. And, you know, I certainly work with couples to find that amicable position when they break up, and I had that in my relationship in the end. But there is that instability that it's like, if we go back into those spaces, then I become dependent on the man, and it's up to the man. The man then has the power to make the decisions of what's right for me, because he has the financial power, and therefore my freedom of movement, of expression, of safety is all dependent on him. I do not want to go back to that.
No.
And I don't know if a man wants to go back to that.
No, and you use this expression caged, and I think a lot of men feel caged by these stereotypes around masculinity. It's limiting us. It's telling us, do not be like this, be like that.
Yeah.
And it doesn't give us freedom of expression, the freedom to be ourselves. So I think the point about the way that I relate to the term toxic masculinity or negative masculinity is negative because it limits men, but it also limits women. Absolutely.
And coming back to the right wing perspective of the roles and the positions being the right place for us to be in, I just want to reiterate that for a man, I imagine even if you have more power in that position, all the responsibility is on you.
Yeah.
And again, then you are naturally being called to stifle your emotions, to become a silent warrior, and to not have that space to be human, to be flexible, to move, to share who you are.
Exactly. It's a pressure that we end up with.
Yeah.
So I know we're running out of time a little bit with this episode, and we haven't come to is what can we do about this?
Yes.
We've talked about a lot of the problems that men face, and I wonder if we could do a part 2 on a future date where we talk about how do you actually address this, either individually or supporting the men around you or as a society.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I wouldn't want to rush the conversation now in order to fit that in, so we can record a part 2 very soon and try to get that out in November as well, because I like that this episode is supporting Movember. Do you want to say a word or two about Movember, like how you understand it as a movement?
I think it started specifically as a campaign to raise awareness about prostate cancer, but it's become more broadly about celebrating and promoting men's physical and mental health.
Yeah.
So I've been running a lot of these workshops for different companies who are wanting to put something on specifically this month, putting a spotlight on men's physical and mental health.
Fantastic. So if anyone wants to invite you to run a workshop on this, then they can get in contact with you directly.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I can run a 1-hour workshop either online or in person where we explore these issues together in your workplace, and really get the conversation going around things that are not talked about enough, considering how much of an impact they're having, not only in terms of the sort of extreme ends of people committing suicide or being in prison, but just day-to-day life. The workplace has been shaped by these traditional masculine stereotypes because the workplace was created by men, and for a long time there were no women in it.
And then quite naturally that energy is going to trickle into the home culture
and the
relationships.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
So it affects all of us. It affects men, women, and whatever you identify as. It's affecting us.
I feel so excited having had this conversation with you, Andy. I feel better equipped to have conversation with curiosity towards men in my life. Like, I really want to. I have this wish that there's certain men in my life, I'd like them to hear the episode and tell me what they think, what's their experience having heard you. Not to say that anything that either of us is right or correct. Like, I want to hear your perspectives, the men out there that are listening, and the other genders that are listening. What are your perspectives on what we've said? Do get in contact with us, share your challenges or your celebrations about what we've brought up, and any questions that you have for us to bring up in the next episode, where we will talk about what can we do about this.
Yes. And just a reminder that we both offer coaching one-to-one. Also, I do a group coaching program, which I'm calling the Man Academy, that helps men to learn some of the skills that they haven't learnt through their fathers or through schools, that help them with some of these masculine stereotypes. So developing emotional intelligence, reconnecting with your body, being able to communicate with vulnerability and honesty and clarity, being able to open up and be authentic. These are some of the things that we explore together in a small group.
And they're all qualities that I very much see in you, Andy, as a very close friend. And so I really trust in you delivering that, because I see you communicating and opening up and being yourself so naturally in our friendship.
Thank you, Emma. Appreciate that.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks for listening. Thanks, Emma.